Welcome to our January 2026 program. As usual, we like to acknowledge the sponsors who enable us to have these programs, as well as fund some of our other activities. They make our work here possible. One of our major sponsors is Kreitz. They sell wonderful cars, as you know, and they have been a very long-time sponsor, faithful sponsor for our organization, and we really appreciate their support. Similarly, Planters Inn our program is a platinum sponsor, and our program speakers stay at the end. They've been very generous to us, and we hope that people will go to these businesses if they're looking for either a nice place to stay or a very nice car. Also, our sponsor for just this month's program, the other two sponsors are platinum sponsors. They support us all year round. This sponsor, Global Post, is our monthly sponsor. Many of you might receive Global Post. As a member, you are eligible to a free subscription to Global Post, which is an independent, nonpartisan newspaper dedicated to world affairs. So if you have not signed up to receive Global Post, look online, reach out to our membership chair. She can help get you signed up if you cannot figure that out. Finally, I need to make a special acknowledgement for the Savannah Book Festival. You've heard about Trivia Night. It's around the corner, and they very generously gave us a lovely prize for us to auction off at that book fair. At our trivia fair, that is a novelist level prize to go to many wonderful things at the Savannah Book Festival. I don't have the details here. I did print them out. Someone might have them. I asked someone to print them. But anyway, I can tell you what it is. But they provided us a wonderful prize, and so I want to just acknowledge their generosity, encourage people to go. If you've never been to the Savannah Book Fair, you really need to go. It's a great, great event. And if you come to the Trivia Night, you can also win an elevated prize access to a variety of things. Upcoming programs, these are straightforward. Again, our programs are always available. The scheduled programs is always available on the website. We keep you up to date with the newsletter, but in case you are trying to organize your vacation around our programs, which I know you do, these are the upcoming programs, and that will be the end. May is the end of our season, so please visit the website for details. So tonight, our speaker, Dr. Brad Setzer, America's economic competition with China, is world trade really de-globalizing? He's the Whitney Shepardson Senior Fellow of the Council on Foreign Relations. As you can see, again, a much more extensive bio is available on the website, as is an abstract. So I encourage you to look at that. But right now, I would like to welcome Dr. Setzer to the stage.
This is a moment of great nervousness, whether the microphone will work. It does. So I'm technical proficiency is always appreciated. So I'm Brad Setzer. I guess I should say I'm from the New York Council on Foreign Relations. I apparently have to apologize for bringing cold weather from the north. And the most common question people ask after I'm introduced is, you're the Whitney Shepardson Senior Fellow. Who is Whitney Shepardson? Which is indeed a good question. I had to look it up myself when I was given the great honor of being the Whitney Shepardson Senior Fellow. It is not the Henry Kissinger Senior Fellow. It is not the David Rockefeller Senior Fellow, nor is it the Stephen Friedheim Senior Fellow, a more recent donor who runs a large private equity firm. Whitney Shepardson, it turns out, is a bit unique because the fellowship was set up in like the 1950s or 1960s by his friends. He wasn't terribly wealthy. But he apparently is one of the original gangsters of the Office of Strategic Services during World War II. Whatever he actually did during that time period seems to be lost in history and secrecy. But I found it amusing. It is not normally a fellowship given to an economist, so I was one of the first. I have worked on sanctions, though, so maybe there's some great convergence. The theme of my talk, I mean, obviously a big part of the talk is going to be about the United States' relationship with China, the world's relationship with China. But the theme of the talk is whether or not the world is deglobalizing. And that theme emerged because deglobalization was one of those words that you read everywhere a couple years ago. Conventional wisdom is an abused term. Who defines what is the conventional wisdom? But if you think of the conventional wisdom as what appears in the pages of the Financial Times or appears in The Economist, something that is used to frame a discussion for pretty much something that people assume is true. The general assumption after President Trump's election in 2016, when he ran a campaign against the Trans-Pacific Partnership and criticized trade, and then after a pandemic which shut down the world economy and illustrated the vulnerabilities of extended supply chains, the general consensus was that the world was inexorably deglobalizing. It had moved towards a high level of global integration after World War II that had perhaps peaked in the 1990s or in the early 2000s when China joined the WTO, but movement was clearly in the opposite direction. I'm a boring data grunt at heart, truly. I looked at the data, and my conclusion was that the conventional wisdom was basically wrong. The world economy was not, in fact, deglobalizing. During the pandemic, we were all at home. We were all buying goods online, and all those goods were actually still coming from China. The supply chain crisis of the summer of 2021 wasn't a crisis caused by the collapse of globalization. It was caused because we didn't have ports that were big enough to handle all the containers that were bringing us the goods that we had ordered during the pandemic. Trade was actually picking up, not slowing down. And when I looked at it a little bit more closely, it was clear that China's own economy, far from deglobalizing, was reglobalizing. China was relying much more on exports, much more on trade than it had in the previous 5 years. So my conclusion was that we weren't deglobalizing, that deglobalization was a myth. But then I kind of had to throw in a little bit of a twist. The other component of my argument was that we were not deglobalizing, but we were not deglobalizing for the wrong reasons. We were not deglobalizing because China's own economy was in the doldrums and China had to rely more on exports because its own economy wasn't generating the demand that was needed to match its increased production. That is not a healthy form of globalization. And then when I looked at some other parts of global trade that were continuing to expand, trade with Ireland, for example, that's been growing like crazy. But I wouldn't call that healthy globalization. A lot of that trade is driven by, guess what? Multinational companies trying to minimize the amount of tax they pay in the United States and pay globally. So in a sense, my argument is, well, maybe we should deglobalize a bit in the sense that China should rely less on the world and a little more on its own demand, and we should make it a little harder for multinationals to shift profits around so easily. That this wasn't healthy, but it was unambiguously still continuing. And that a political or economic agenda framed around an assumption that globalization was inevitably on the edge of collapse was going to miss some important things. Now, that said, and this is one of the points that I'll cover, the notion of globalization as something that we should embrace, welcome, and encourage, the notion that we should have policies that push for more globalization, what you might call globalization as a political project, that is dead. And therefore there's a question of what politically comes next. So before talking about China, I'm going to be really boring. Sometimes it's useful to define a few terms. Kind of dull, very lecture-y. So what do we mean with de-globalization? What is the concrete measures that one should use to evaluate if the world's de-globalizing or not? It seems sort of self-evident, less global trade, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that is a fair way of looking at it. But since in general global economy does grow, in general global trade does grow, one of the measures that I'm going to emphasize is whether or not imports and exports are growing at the same speed as the overall economy or at a slower speed. And so if imports or exports are growing faster, I'm going to call that globalization or faster globalization. And if they're growing more slowly, I think you can argue that's a form of de-globalization. Now there's another word which is very much used in the IMF, which is fragmentation. The world economy is fragmenting, less integrated, less united, less well knit together. And I think you can think of fragmentation, which is a form of de-globalization, in a couple of different ways. The world could fragment along regional lines, which, is arguably still a form of globalization. There's a lot of trade between the US and Mexico, but not so much trade between the US and India. Less trade across the Pacific, more trade in the Americas. That would be fragmentation along regional lines. And then the world economy, at least conceptually, could fragment along political lines. That was the general thesis after the pandemic, that there would be less trade across blocks of countries that politically were not similar. Now then, how do you define political similarity? It actually gets to be complicated. Are you formally allied? All right, that's one thing. Well, we have some weird things, like we're not technically allied with Ireland. I mean, Ireland's not part of NATO. They don't have an army. Sort of strange, but look it up, it's true. So that would be one, is who are you allied with? Another would be, who do you have similar forms of government with? Democracies, autocracies. Well, that also turns out to be a little bit awkward. We are unambiguously allied with the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. We clearly, although if I were to make maybe this is slightly changing to be a little bit mean. We don't actually have a king. We are not a kingdom, although we do now have a ballroom. And our ballroom may have some similarity to the royal ballroom in the Saudi Arabian kingdom. Who knows? But you end up with sort of awkwardness when you try to define precisely what you mean by fragmenting along political lines. But the general sense would be that we would trade more with our traditional allies, including our traditional economic allies like Ireland, and we would trade less with the big autocracies of the world, Russia, Saudi Arabia, not Saudi Arabia, Iran, and China. And that would be a form of fragmentation. I'm also going to talk a lot about whether trade is balanced or not, and there's no complicated measure there. It is simply, are your exports equal to your imports? And if you have a deficit or a surplus, is that deficit with countries that are your political allies, or is it with countries that are on the other side of the political divide? And my argument would be that if you have a big deficit and the big surplus is found with a country on the other side of the political divide, maybe the world hasn't entirely fragmented along economic lines. Why is that important? China. So the big important not de-globalizing economy in the world right now is China. China runs a big trade surplus, right? Yeah, massive, over $1 trillion, $1.2 trillion. That is up from a few years ago when it was only $400 billion. Where is the biggest trade deficit in the world? Still, unambiguously in the United States. Right. And over time, the amount of the world's trade surplus that is in China, past 10 years, has gone way up. The amount of the world's trade deficit that's found in the US has also gone up in dollar terms, but basically stayed the same. So in some broad sense, the big surplus and the big deficit are on opposite sides of the world, on opposite sides of the political divide, and this form of deglobalization, of separation, hasn't happened. There is no way globally China can run a $1.2 trillion trade surplus if some country that's big is not running an offsetting trade deficit. And the candidates are the US and the UK, because Japan has well, they're basically actually in balance, Europe has a surplus, so forth and so on. No fragmentation in that sense. Now, of course, there are tariffs, and the tariffs have had some impact. The tariffs have reduced direct trade with China. We used to import $500 billion of stuff from China, now it's $350 billion, and as a share of GDP, it's gone down by even more. But that fall in our bilateral trade with China has not corresponded with a fall in China's global trade or a change in China's global trade balance. A few years back, before the pandemic, and for the 5 years preceding that, exports had actually been falling as a share of China's GDP, and imports were actually falling as a share of China's GDP. You could make an argument that China was, in that sense, de-globalizing. Why? Well, China was growing really fast during that period of time, and it was growing really fast on the basis of a property boom, huge amounts of construction. And that construction was leading China to grow fast, and it was letting China absorb most of its own output. China made a lot of steel, but that steel went into all the buildings that were going up that were impressing everyone who visited China. That has changed. China's exports are now growing much faster than China's economy. So as a share of GDP, exports of manufacturers had fallen below 15%, down to 15-16% of China's GDP. They're now back up to 18%. China's imports, particularly of manufactured goods, have fallen. They were 10% of China's GDP. They're now 8% of China's GDP. So China's overall trade surplus in manufacturing has gone from 6% of GDP, 6% of its GDP, to 10 percentage points of its GDP. So how is that deglobalization? China is relying more on exports, relying more on the rest of the world for demand, and more reliant on selling stuff to the rest of the world. It's clearly not. China has not removed itself from the world economy. And what's striking is that this shift came along even as the US was putting tariffs on China. I mean, unambiguously, tariffs on China have gone up. They were roughly 2%, and under Trump 1, they went up to 15. We adjusted trade, so the effective tariff rate fell to 10 because you import more of what you don't tariff and you import less of what is heavily tariffed. And we put another 10 percentage points in an overall tariff on China, a 20% tariff on fentanyl, and then China retaliated and we put tariffs up to 100%, and boom, then we had to bring them down. No doubt that there was a massive political effort to reduce trade with China. It just didn't reduce China's global trade. And what I would argue is it actually hasn't reduced our dependence on China all that much, because it is pretty easy to get around. This is like the dirty little secret of trade nerds. It's pretty easy to get around a direct bilateral tariff. The tariff only applies if a good goes directly from Shanghai, I guess, to the port of Savannah, or the port of Long Beach. If you ship a part to Vietnam, put another part from somewhere else, doesn't have to, there's no value of that extra part test. All you have to do is a transformation with a good from another tariff code. You can't take a good, take it out of a package, disassemble it, and put it back in the package and send it on. That's illegal. But if you take a good out of a package, disassemble it, get rid of the screws, and bring in new screws, you're probably actually going to be okay. So final assembly shifted to places that were less tariff, Southeast Asia. But the total reliance on China didn't go down. And I think it is important to recognize that China's export success and its reliance on exports and the limits on the tariffs as a way of forcing China to trade less came in part because you were fighting against the natural forces of the global economy and the fact that China actually had a major economic crisis during the pandemic. You know, we kind of forget about it because it's during the pandemic and there are other things, but China's real estate bubble burst. And when real estate bubbles burst, your economy suffers. That happened to us in the global financial crisis. It happened to Spain. It happened to Thailand back in 1997. And what do economies generally do when their real estate sector is going down, when employment in the real estate sector is going down, when people are feeling less wealthy? They rely on the rest of the world for demand. And so that is very much what China has done. Statistically, the increase in China's exports over the last 5 years is as big as any increase we've seen. It is an increase, their manufacturing surplus has gone up by $1 trillion, which is big. That's 1 percentage point of world GDP. That is equal to the shock that is now called the first China shock, which is this increase in imports into the US that came after China joined the WTO. So this is not a modest shift in China towards being more reliant on the world. It's a major shift. And it's associated with certain forms of dependence. So to make all these shifts kind of concrete, I wanted to talk about autos. I guess your sponsors would be proud. Anyone know how many autos are sold in a typical year in the world? Guesses?
24 million.
20? Yeah, no, not quite. Up.
30 million.
30 million? Oh, no, still up.
40.
Up. Yeah, I mean,
60 million.
you got to go up.
All right, 100 million.
Now you got to go down. Split the difference, 80 to 85 million. All right. Anyone know how many of those are sold in China?
Half.
No. The first guess, 25 million is the right number for auto sales in China. So you do the math, work that out. There's 55 to 60 million cars sold globally outside of China. Anyone know how many cars are sold in the United States in a normal year?
16 million.
Yeah, oh, correct. All right, so roughly a quarter of non-Chinese demand. Anyone know how many cars are sold in the EU?
Roughly the same, a little less.
Yeah, exactly. So roughly the same. So of that, you kind of got 25 million in China, and you kind of got, let's say 15, 16, 17 million, depending on the year in the US, 20 million in North America, 15 million in Europe, and the rest, 5 in India, 5 in Japan, da 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 da. 5 years ago, China exported 1 million vehicles. They weren't very good vehicles 5 years ago. They were mostly, a lot of them were trucks to the markets in Africa and Central Asia. 5 years ago, China imported about 1 million cars. Anyone know where those cars came from? A little bit from the US, but not so much because we fought a trade war with China, so they'd tariffed the hell out of BMW South Carolina when we tariffed China. Europe. And who's the biggest auto producer in Europe? Germany. All right. Mercedes, BMW, Audi all had a strategy where they produced low-end cars for China in China, but high-end cars were mostly made in Europe and sold to China. So like China's auto trade just 5 years ago was balanced. Now, before the pandemic, China's auto market had been growing. It kind of started to stop growing a couple years before the pandemic. And China had built up domestic production capacity to make conventional engine cars, their ICE cars in the jargon, in excess of its own demand. So the general estimate was that before the pandemic, China could make about 40 million cars. And there was a decent amount of excess capacity in China. A friend of mine, Keith Bradshaw, writes about the automotive industry in China for the New York Times. He says one of the things that the Trump tariffs did effectively was that they kept Ford from using its spare capacity in China to produce small cars for the US market. So that there was spare capacity, but it was sort of bottled up and not much was being exported. So like that's the world that we have then. China still has, at that, even 5 years ago, had the capacity to make almost half of the world's cars, but it was making a little more than a quarter of the world's cars, and its demand, that was basically to meet its own demand. So what has happened over the past 5 years in the global auto industry? What?
Electric car.
All right, where is the global epicenter of electric car production? China. Where does Tesla make the most cars? China. Where is the biggest market for electric vehicles? China. All right, so China is now, over half of China's domestic demand is being met with electric cars. So 13, 14 million cars a year are being, electric cars are being made in China, sold to China. How many electric cars could China make in 2020 on the edge of the pandemic? No, they can make a few. They weren't very good, but they can make a few. 2 million. So they've gone from 2 to producing at least their own demand, which is now 13, 14, right? They are also now exporting. Latest data would be 4 million electric cars, which is, by the way, 4 times as many as Tesla makes in the United States. It's big money, big sum. So they're producing at least 20 million electric cars right now. At least, with a capacity probably to make 25, maybe more, growing by roughly 5 million a year because of all the investment in the automotive sector. That's a really big shift, obviously. So what happened to all those conventional car factories that were around and producing cars for China's domestic market 5 years ago? Very few of them actually were turned over to making electric cars. Most of the companies making electric cars are like BYD, they're new ones. It's very modest conversion. So an awful lot, a decent amount of those factories are just not being used. But the others are being used to export. Well, why not? You had the capacity to make 40 million conventional cars. Demand has fallen to under 15. Sell as many as you can to the rest of the world. So big markets, Mexico. GM supplies a lot of Mexico from China. Big market, Russia. That's probably a little bit of fragmentation because, Russia's invasion of Ukraine led to European companies to be basically squeezed out of the market. But huge shift. So today, there's a debate. 40 million old cars, 25 million new cars, minus whatever was converted or factories have been shut down. But China has the capacity to make 60, 65 million cars a year, 3/4 of world demand, well over 2 times its own demand. And it is now exporting 7 million passenger cars a year, 8 million passenger cars a year, more than Japan ever did. That has been going up really fast. And if you look at the data for December, which is a strong month, China was exporting 10 million passenger cars, and its imports are 500,000. Remember the math we started off with, where the global market is around 60 million outside China. That's a lot. That is a big change. And that, in my view, is why, say, Germany is actually de-globalizing. I think German exports have actually, Germany's economy isn't growing, so in that sense they're not de-globalizing, but German exports aren't growing, they've actually been falling. because it's really punished Germany's auto industry. So massive changes. But the global auto industry, in a sense, globalized. And the global auto industry, in a sense, did not fragment. Didn't fragment along political lines. 5 years ago, China was not the main source of autos made outside of China. Now it is. That, to me, is this unhealthy reglobalization. And why are auto companies globally petrified? Well, they can't produce cars at China's price point. They know China has all this excess capacity, and they, frankly, many of them don't know what to do. We're a little insulated because of our tariffs, but Europe is feeling it. And it's a nice concrete example of an economic imbalance. Right? It's one thing for trade to mean I buy more of your stuff and you buy more of my stuff. What's happening with China in the auto sector is China's imports have gone down. They've fallen by 50%, okay, from 1 million to 500,000, and their exports have just gone through the roof. So we have an enormous imbalance in auto trades, which matches this imbalance in aggregate trade, and means there are fewer jobs making autos outside of China, more jobs making autos inside China. It helps offset China's domestic weakness, but it creates frictions and problems. Last point I'll make here, and then we'll talk about my favorite topic, which is actually Ireland, not China. Electric vehicles run on batteries, right? Not a complicated thing. Batteries are chemical creatures. You need certain rare minerals, not so rare minerals. You need lithium. You need to process it. Da, 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 da. What else runs on batteries other than your phone, which is a good answer? A lot of things run on batteries. Something that's become really, really important in the geostrategic field, key element of Ukraine's defense, drones. Right? So query, China also makes 85% of the world's drones, by the way. Evolved, a modern drone is supposedly integrating an electric, the motor that you run in a coffee grinder, fast rotational energy with a battery. Both industries dominated by China. China is the world's leading producer of drones. Drones have evolved to be the key technology of defensive warfare. And the basic question that I think a lot of militaries and strategists are dealing with globally is, can you have a drone industry if you don't have an EV industry and a battery industry? Which is a real difficult question. And that does generate some real pressure for de-globalization, despite all the forces that I've mentioned that have pushed the other way. So the other driver of unhealthy globalization, because I think China's urge to exports to make up for internal weakness without doing any imports, and China really isn't importing. Over the past 2 years, China's exports have grown by 10% in volume terms, and Chinese imports are basically flat, zero. China's exports are growing at 3 times the pace of global trade on average over the past 2 years. Their imports are growing best at 1% when their domestic economy is growing, at least in theory, at 3 to 4%. That's unusual. That's imbalanced. But the other driver of unhealthy globalization, in my view, is it gets me into trouble in corporate audiences, tax avoidance. Tax avoidance. How many of you take prescription drugs? I will include myself. Lots of them. My doctor is a big believer in modern chemistry. 2016, 2017, we were importing a decent amount of prescription drugs. Anyone know what country is the biggest supplier of prescription drugs, patent-protected drugs to the U.S. market?
India.
No, in dollar terms. Ireland, yeah. Ireland. Oh, absolutely. Ireland is a pharmaceutical superpower. So 10 years ago, we were importing $25, $30 billion a year in patent-protected drugs from Ireland. This year, we're going to import $120 billion of patent-protected drugs from Ireland. Anyone know which country generates our biggest bilateral trade deficit in Europe? Ireland, yeah, the top Germany now. Forget the cars, it's all about the drugs. Which companies are doing most of their drug production in Ireland? Well, mostly US companies, yeah. It's actually not the French or the Swiss. It is Johnson & Johnson's, it's Merck, it's Pfizer, it's Eli Lilly. Big jump in 2024 was actually Eli Lilly making their weight loss drug, which is a blockbuster, if you haven't heard, in Ireland. And so you see huge surges in imports from Ireland. Anyone have a sense of how much money multinational companies report earning in Ireland? It's now 250 billion euros, close 275 billion dollars, close to a percentage point of US GDP, over a percentage point of European GDP. Huge number. 10 years ago, that was roughly 50 billion. No, it's gone up from 50 to 250. Now, to be fair, part of that is because profits that previously were hidden in the Caribbean, Bermuda, British Virgin Islands, have, because of certain tax reforms, had to migrate to Ireland. So it's not just organic growth in profits in Ireland. It is something more general, which is that in order to maintain your low tax advantages, you needed to produce in Ireland and be a tax resident of an OECD country. So we are economically sort of allied with Ireland, you know, even if we aren't politically. Anyone know how much, and I have to be very precise because I've been lawyered up on this issue. Anyone know how much money America's top 6 pharmaceutical companies set aside to pay US corporate income tax out of their 2024 earnings? Anyone know how much they earned globally, ballpark? Okay, 70 billion, 70, 80. How much did they set aside to pay US tax? Correct.
What?
The zero. Zero. Now, Eli Lilly did pay a little bit, others had negatives. But of the 10 billion in tax that they paid globally, all of that was paid outside of the United States. The tax game for a pharmaceutical company is you do your research and development in the United States, but you finance that using money from your European subsidiary, so they have the intellectual property rights outside the United States. You produce it outside the United States. You count that as a foreign profit, and under the previous tax code, that would qualify for a guilty profit, global intangible low tax income, and be taxed at 10.5%. After the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, it's got a different name. It's ugly, even uglier than guilty. The guilty felt wrong, so they changed it. And it's now like qualified business income abroad or something, less exciting. And it's now taxed at 12.5. If you were selling in the US market, had your intellectual property in the US and were producing in the US, you would have no basis for not being taxed at the headline rate of 21. So in order to get a lower rate, in a sense, you have to produce abroad, which is why all the companies do this. Now, I obviously have argued that this should be changed. Unfortunately, I have failed to convince either a majority of Democrats or a majority of Republicans to generate the needed votes. And it is genuinely one of the least healthy aspects of globalization. Now, the US is getting zero in corporate tax revenue from our pharmaceutical companies globally. Ireland is now reporting $30 billion a year in corporate income tax. The real Irish economy, so take away the tax avoidance bit, is estimated to be roughly $300 billion. So Ireland is getting 10% of GDP in corporate income tax from companies that aren't even Irish, mostly. All right, $30 billion is real money. So I've been trying to convince people to take this more seriously. So I'll try this out on you. What can you buy if you're a military strategist with $30 billion a year in extra revenue? You can buy 2 nuclear aircraft carriers, which are the most expensive items in our fleet. Each is about $15 billion, or 5 to 6 nuclear attack submarines. Over a 10-year period, okay, now to be fair, our submarine industry cannot produce that many subs that quickly. But if we had expanded and had the demand and did it all, we could be building 50 nuclear subs over a 10-year horizon, which probably, if you ask a Navy guy, would be enough to have a material impact on the military balance around Taiwan. So this is not something that I think we should easily turn a blind eye to. Now, if I'm precise, of that 30 billion, 5 is coming from Irish companies, 25 is probably coming from foreign companies. Not all of it's going to be coming from US companies, but most of it is. And if it was US profit, we could probably tax it at a slightly higher rate. So I don't think my numbers are enormously off. And to be fair, I've picked on the pharmaceutical industry because it's tangible, it's concrete, and because it is mostly profits earned in the United States. We pay the highest prices by far for world drugs. But Apple, on its own, Apple's a very profitable company, makes about $120 billion a year. It makes roughly, according to its accounting, $70 billion, or the majority of its profit, not in the United States, not in China, not in any of the markets where it sells its goods, but in Ireland. And Microsoft also reports about $40 billion of its over $100 billion global profit is earned by its Irish subsidiary. In both cases, they're booking all of their global sales through Ireland. Their global profit is in Ireland, and Ireland gets the first cut on its tax. Now, I would submit that this level of cross-border profit shifting is an unhealthy form of globalization that should be brought to an end. There would be nothing wrong if American pharmaceutical companies made drugs for the US market in the United States, reported a US profit, and paid US tax. In a sense, that's what kind of should happen. I've got to even though I'm clearly a Democrat, if you read my bio, I'm a little Trumpy there. And I'm a little disappointed that Trump didn't actually make this a priority in the tax negotiations. Next point. Globalization as a political project, as opposed to a globalization as an economic reality, is dead. There is no majority in the United States for policy steps that would lead to more global integration. We do not want our economy to be more integrated with that of China. We don't believe that economic integration will lead to a change in Chinese policy, which was one of the core beliefs around China's WTO accession. There isn't actually, I would argue, a political consensus right now to rely as much as we do on China. I didn't talk about the other parts of the pharmaceutical sector, the generics, but we rely pretty heavily on China for generic drugs. They don't sell for much. There's not a big profit number. The dollar value isn't that big, and a lot of it comes through India. But most people, I don't think, would vote for an economic project of relying on China to make even more of critical medicines. Most people would probably vote for an economic project around putting that closer to home, in friends, so forth and so on. Clearly, there are pressures created by China's massive surplus, most visible now in Europe, where the automotive industry has taken a hit, to reduce trade. If trade means China exports to you but doesn't buy more of your goods, which is what it has meant for the past 10 years, there isn't a majority for keeping that kind of unbalanced trading relationship. So as a political project, globalization is finished, at least for the foreseeable future. The question is what comes after it as a political project. What has emerged is a hodgepodge where we don't want to become more integrated, but we are still increasingly integrated with China, just indirectly through third parties. where we, in theory, want America first, but we let American companies pay tax in Ireland first. So what could come next? Here's 4 different visions for what could emerge. One vision might be what you might call America alone. The US raises tariffs and other barriers on everyone. And as a result, we trade less with everyone. And if we do that sufficiently aggressively, and if we use the tariff revenue to reduce our budget deficit rather than to fund other tax cuts or more spending, you could, through tariffs, generate some kind of reduction in the trade deficit, not just a reduction in trade. But that's one coherent vision. The US, we're a big economy, quarter of the world economy. As the president sometimes says, what does Canada make that we need? What does the world make that we really need? Okay, bananas, coffee, a few things. But you could have a coherent vision, which is just a big tariff wall around the United States. There's another vision, which you might call China alone. If all the countries of the world collectively put up trade barriers on goods from China, then China would trade less. Doesn't matter what China wants to do, China would be forced to trade less because of, you have to have at least one market that's willing to accept your goods. And if everyone has put up barriers, that would isolate China. And at least conceptually, if you isolated China, you wouldn't necessarily have to have barriers outside of China. So the global economy would remain integrated, but China would be deintegrated from the world. That's kind of China alone. Another vision might be that the world would divide into regional blocks, spheres of economic influence, and it would be trade within North America. Could be North and South America. But we would fragment along regional lines. Now that's slightly awkward for Asia, because Japan and China aren't a natural economic bloc. It's not so awkward for Europe, which is already an economic bloc. But set those small questions aside, that's a vision. Another vision might be the world would truly fragment or fracture along political lines. So it wouldn't be that everyone would isolate China, but a group of democracies would put tariffs on China and Russia and Iran and their closest allies. And therefore the world would fragment so that the autocracies would trade with autocracies and democracies would trade with democracies. Now, query where China's surplus goes if China's only trading with Russia. It's not a simple question. And query how we could run a $1.2, $1.1 trillion deficit if no of our allies are running that big of a surplus, because that's now being run by China. It would require some adjustment, but that is a vision. I think right now we've kind of chosen a little bit of all of the above in a kind of incoherent way, which isn't entirely working. I do believe, and I think I'll conclude on this, that we will ultimately have to a degree, pick amongst some of these competing visions. Thank you.
Brad, thank you very, very much. You've given us a lot of food for thought. I was telling Brad in the car on the way in from the airport that we never have to encourage people to ask questions because there are usually more questions than we have time for, and they're always, thankfully, very really incisive and intelligent questions. So we'll open up. Please raise your hand. I will recognize you and come around one by one. So let me come here first.
So to stay on the tax thing, there is some effort globally to try to create a regime, which I think notoriously some U.S. companies over the last few days were just given exemptions. Can you talk a little bit about that? Is it going to be effective? Does it have any impact? I mean, what's it about?
Yeah, I've worked on that. It's called the OECD two-pillar project. Pillar one is pretty much dead. It was an effort to have some of the profit of a global company be taxed in the location where it generates most of its sales. So the idea was that, and it becomes complicated because technically a company like Google generates most of its non-US sales out of Ireland. That's where their ad sales software is. You buy from Google Ireland, but you're buying to eyeballs that are not Irish, and so you can identify the market based on where the eyeballs are. And in theory, the idea was you'd allocate a portion of the global profit to the country that's generating the sales or the eyeballs. And at least in theory, that would have addressed some of Europe's concerns that the big US tech companies are paying tax in Ireland, but they aren't paying tax in their countries. And they're paying tax in the US, but not in their countries. But Google, obviously its ad business has decimated a lot of traditional news print businesses that used to pay some tax. So it's like, that's kind of pillar one. The tech companies were really good about saying how this was Europe raiding the US. It's actually Europe raiding Ireland, when you think about it. But we would have actually gotten a lot of tax revenue gotten a little bit of tax revenue from Mercedes and BMW, generating sales. They don't book many profits in the US. We'd have actually generated a lot of tax revenue, quote, from the pharma companies who weren't paying tax in the US, according to my earlier analysis, but were generating the bulk of their sales in the US. That didn't make it more popular with the pharma companies. That's dead. The US is not signing up to it. There's another part which is a global minimum tax on corporate profits. And that follows on an effort where you can no longer be a tax resident in a no tax jurisdiction. So you cannot be a tax resident of Bermuda or if you're inside a normal country. You cannot have a subsidiary with a lot of profits in a jurisdiction which doesn't have a corporate income tax, which is a lot of the Caribbean. And you can't have a stateless profit. Apple, before 2014, said that its international operations were Irish for US tax purposes and US for Irish tax purposes, and therefore were globally untaxed. So that was foreclosed. Now, the minimum tax has some problems. The US has refused to sign up. We basically said our minimum tax, guilty, the new 12.5 has to suffice. We're not going to go up to the 15 minimum. But then 15 minimum is 15 after your deduction, so it isn't really 15. And it doesn't completely solve the problems that I was identifying because there's a lot of US companies that would rather pay 15 minus the deductions abroad rather than pay 21 in the US. There are even more technical complexities around it. I think it was a valiant effort. I do not think it will solve the problem or change the set of incentives that I mentioned. What has had an impact is, Google and NVIDIA, which are very profitable companies, are now US, they put their intellectual property in the US, and it is taxed in the US at a special low rate. I don't love the low rate, but it is clearly to our advantage to have their global profits be taxed in the US at 14 rather than to be taxed in Ireland at 10 or 12. It does generate a sort of feeling of unfairness. Like, why should the world's most profitable companies be taxed at a lower rate than a small business? But as a pragmatic accommodation, that did bring Google as a tax resident back to the US. I'm happy to talk about this at length with anyone else who's interested. But I will assume that this is not the only topic of...
Another question down front court.
Brad, that was great. Thanks very much. You talked a lot about China. And question, what do we do about China? It's a completely different system, demand-driven, an economy that's run by fiat. Not like this one. What do you recommend? How do you recommend we deal with China?
We need to be exceptionally strategic. And by that, I mean we need to understand where China has economic leverage over us. The rare earths and permanent magnet story is an important one. We should never have allowed China to make 98 or 99, or process, not make, it's processing, 98 or 99 of the heavy rare earths. The heavy rare earths and the magnets that come from heavy rare earths are actually most used in the defense industry because they are stable at very high temperatures, which makes them very important for radars and missile guidance systems. So that's the kind of thing, that's the opposite of strategic. When you're 98 or 99% reliant on processing of a mineral that is vital, but not very valuable. But if you don't have it, you can't make it. And we allowed those kinds of dependencies to build across our economy. So by being strategic, I think we have to find ways to reduce those dependencies. But in the near term, I mean, I don't disagree with the president that you have to make some deals to get access to some of the rare earths in the interim. You just can't rely on China forever. You have to have a strategy for identifying those areas where China either has or is about to develop a choke point control over a critical technology, and then, depending on your view, either make sure that that production there's another source or an American source. A source outside China or an American source, or maybe both. I mean, for some of the more defense critical ones, I'm of the view that Europe should find its rare earths, we should find our rare earths, and a bit of redundancy there wouldn't be that bad. I think we need to put and encourage our allies to move towards something which is closer to the China alone argument that I made. If everybody puts tariffs on China, then we can trade much more freely amongst ourselves. We all have problems with China's automotive overcapacity. I think all the major economies that have domestic auto industries do not want the solution to China's overcapacity to be that their domestic industry disappears. And as I mentioned, what does it mean to have an economy that can produce 55 million cars with 25 million of domestic demand? You've got 30 million cars, 25 million cars that can be exported. The US market is 15, the European market is 15. Those markets could be all supplied from China. And I think the realistic answer is, if we want to maintain trade amongst ourselves, you don't have trade in at least some sectors with China. I think I think we need to work towards tariffs on embedded Chinese content, at least in some sectors. So it's silly to put a 50% tariff on China and a 0% tariff on a good from Vietnam that is 90% Chinese content. All right? Now, it turns out that as a matter of pragmatic trade law / tariff collection, we don't have the capacity to know that a good is 90% Chinese. And that is not what our companies report at the border. That's not what the Customs and Border Patrol. So it would be a huge change. Our trade law is based on a world where basically all tariffs were 0 or low, in which case you don't have to worry that much about the rules of origin. If you want to get serious around the China stuff and create incentives, I would be in favor of an escalating set of tariffs on embedded Chinese content. And I would be in favor of having everyone else do that too. And then I'm not a huge believer in tariffs in general. I'm more a believer in tariffs against China. But I would love to see China, and I hope President Macron of France's efforts to convince China to change some of its policies succeed. I would love to see China rely more on its own demand. And I would love to see China let its currency appreciate so that it's not producing cars at half the world's price. All right? That is a fake difference. And China may be a bit more productive, but it's not that much more productive. And so as I said, I'm a data geek and nerd at heart. There was a data point that came out earlier today that says that China's state banks bought $100 billion of foreign exchange in the month of December. That was way more than they bought in previous months to keep their currency from rising. So we are back into a world where China really is manipulating its currency. That's kind of like, we need industrial policies, we need to be strategic about them, we need some tariffs, we need our allies to tariff China, and I'm a believer that in the old line that we should fight a trade war against China, not with our traditional friends.
Brett, China's being more strategic than we are.
President Xi was very well prepared for President Trump's second term and for the revival of the tariff threat. He'd been building up the capacity to put export controls on China's minerals, rare earths, and permanent magnets for a time. He kept that capacity pretty hidden, and he rolled it out in a very strategic way. China has yet to order a single Boeing after we did the Trump 1 tariffs. Now, clearly, they're going to have to order some Boeings because otherwise they give Airbus a monopoly on wide bodies. And if you give Airbus a monopoly on wide bodies, they're not going to have an incentive to move production to China, and they certainly aren't going to give you your best price. So you have to eventually throw a few planes to Boeing's way. But that's something he's held out. And the thing he did that convinced me that they had thought super seriously about every point of leverage is that they threatened to withdraw the money that China's sovereign wealth fund has invested in U.S. private equity funds, which includes some of Trump's biggest supporters and friends, which is the kind of small ball thing you do when you have thought through every possibility. So yes, I think China I don't think China is always strategic, but I think China and Xi did a very good job of wargaming a second trade war.
Good evening, and thank you very much for your presentation. In a world where not just tariffs, but also sanctions kind of dominate the headlines, but also the global economy, I kind of wanted to hear your perspective on how these sanctions in the wake of like Israel, Palestine, Russia, Ukraine, how they've affected, or how might they affect China's global trade strategy, or how it has already affected it.
So we, the U.S., I worked on sanctions when I was at the Treasury. We, the G7, back when there was a G7, we, the U.S. and our traditional allies, actually haven't put very many sanctions on China. So the quick answer is that is a threat that could be rolled out, but it probably wouldn't be rolled out except in a Taiwan crisis contingency. Why? Because of this unbalanced nature of trade. If China's not allowed to buy our financial assets, how do we finance our trade deficit? If China's state banks can't operate in dollars, that's a problem for parts of our financial market as well as a problem for China. We've shown we have, because of the sanctions we employed against Russia after their invasion of Ukraine, we could freeze China's reserves in the US. Now, China's done some strategies to counter that. We could freeze all of the US assets of their big state banks. Those are at least 200 billion, probably more. But if we do that, we have to accept the consequences. And that would be true deglobalization. That would be the end of a lot of trade. So we've held that in reserve. Sanctions as a tool of leverage haven't been as effective as many people had hoped. We've froze Russia's reserves, and that freezing worked. Russia hasn't touched that money. But Russia was making enough money off its oil that it didn't need to dip into its reserves. We have done various versions of sanctions on parts of Russia's oil. But in order to be fully effective, you have to be willing to fully take Russia's oil off the market. And as a general matter, certainly not the previous president, and I don't even think this president, were ever willing to do that. We, as in we the US, but we the Biden administration, in the summer of 2022, oil was at 120, 130, 140. Americans were mad. And there was no willingness to take Russia's exports 5-6 billion barrels a day, which were still flowing, off the market. That's it's actually roughly a tenth of global traded oil. It would pushed prices probably up to 200 at that time. Now it's a little easier now because there's spare capacity in the global market, there's more flex, you could deal with it, but do you want oil at 50, as President 53 was his latest target, or do you want oil at 80, 90, 100? You know, these are the kinds of trade-offs you face. The sanctions on Iran have isolated Iran, but they haven't changed Iran. I believe that sanctions have a role, don't get me wrong. I believe that I think the sanctions against Taiwan, against China, should they move on Taiwan, are an important retaliatory threat. I think it would certainly, we'd be in a worse position if Russia could use its reserves rather than Russia not use its reserves. But I also think, you know, there's a tendency sometimes to think that, you know, really bold sanctions will solve every problem, and that hasn't been the historical experience. Israel, there isn't that significant a set of sanctions that are relevant there beyond the sanctions on Iran, which predate Gaza.
Question over on the side. Whitney, go on, right?
If AI starts to deliver what's promising over the next 3 to 5 years, do you see that having a major effect on the current trade deficits that exist between different countries?
Oh, not really. So what do I see AI doing right now? First of all, AI right now is pushing our trade deficit up. All right? All the data centers are being built with computers that are mostly made out of Asian electronics. Our imports of semiconductors and computers are up about $200 billion, from 300 to 500. So the short run effect is we have to import a lot of largely Asian, heavily Taiwanese. Taiwan's surplus is just through the roof right now to build out the data centers, et cetera, et cetera. What are the future revenue streams that will accrue to US companies from this? Well, a lot of it seems, at least to me, to be a substitute for search, which is why Google and Alphabet have invested so heavily in it. If it's just substituting for search, Google's going to be replacing its significant global profit stream from search with a new AI-ish profit stream. If you want to take a more optimistic view, you can imagine that we would generate bigger paid revenue streams from AI. But so far, those revenue streams haven't really materialized. But you could think of it a bit like you think of, you know, I guess you could either think of it a bit like you would think of Microsoft, which, let's forget their advertising business, gets money from selling subscriptions to their software, and that shows up as an export, and that's like $100 billion coming into the US economy. Or you could think of it as something like Google, which is financed by Google or the advertisers. You know, you search using AI for hotels in Tuscany, and someone bids for that to advertise alongside that or to appear higher in the AI or whatever the mechanism is, which is replicating the Google revenue stream. And those streams are roughly a percentage point of our economy. So you could think about that as pushing that up a bit. But I tend to view it more incrementally than revolutionary. I'm more on the skeptical side. But I'm also like not an AI data guy. It's like I'm actually really happy that AI has yet to differentiate between fiscal debt, public debt, and external debt. So for the stuff that I specialize in, AI gives garbled answers, and I'm happy about that. I need to keep that in place for the next 5 years. That's my little personal test.
Brad, if I might ask a question, I think it might be of interest. I think it was yesterday, and you were talking about these, sometimes we have strange relationships that politically don't match between democracies and autocracies or monarchies or whatever, but are economically extremely important and close. So yesterday, the government of the United Arab Emirates just signed what is called Pax Silica agreement. And Pax Silica, which I didn't really know much about before, is a pact created by, a structure created by the United States to bring together countries that are working in the field of artificial intelligence to secure supply lines for example. How important are things like Pax Silica? That's not really globalization, maybe it's more regionalization, maybe it's among certain like-minded countries, although not the same systems. So, do you have a view on that?
I mean, I think it falls within a couple of different genres of economic statecraft. It does fall a little bit into the let's work more closely with our friends, defined broadly, than with just every country. And that if you're part of the club, you get certain benefits, and we get certain benefits. The benefit you get, presumably, is access to Taiwanese-made chips designed by this small American company called NVIDIA that is one of the world's most profitable companies right now. And everybody...
These are the shareholders.
Yeah, well, thank you. Please contribute generously to the Savannah Council, because if you had a meaningful part of your portfolio in NVIDIA, you've done well. And you haven't paid much tax either, for the record. Realize some of your capital gains. I'm glad NVIDIA now has its IP in the US rather than Singapore. That they've gone up in my estimation. But so there's a component of that. There's a component, I think, of kind of investing in developing alternative sources of semiconductor production to Taiwan and to China. Now that's a little awkward because I think Taiwan may be part of Pax, certainly after the trade deal today. It's awkward to exclude Taiwan. It is awkward to rely entirely on Taiwan. And we've been trying to navigate that for a while. But as I sort of alluded to, I realize I'm at odds with many of my friends on both sides of the aisle on this. I am not a big believer in the idea that we can rely on the Emirates and even more democratic countries like Japan and Korea to be the source of financing for every industrial policy that makes every strategically important good in the United States. There's a part of me which thinks that if it is truly strategic important, you don't rely on others. And you certainly don't rely on on either their benevolence or the fact that they will always be sufficiently scared of your tariff threat to cough up the money. At some point, you probably should do it using at least a little bit of US taxpayer funds. And I think using US taxpayer funds also has the advantage of it doesn't get channeled through rather opaque mechanisms which aren't super visible and where contracts can maybe go in a politically connected way. There's a part of me which is very nervous about big investment deals, which are where large sums of money are going into politically connected parts of the US economy with no scrutiny. And that nervousness goes up when a country like the Emirates or Saudi Arabia is involved, because I guess somewhat cynically, I don't view them as the least corrupt parts of the global economy.
Well said.
This will be the last question.
Okay, the last question. So thank you so much. That was so informative and wonderful. So can I ask you if you really believe that the United States? I'm so sorry.
Ice cream cone.
So you told us that the United States is choosing the policy of all of the above, which is incoherent, right? And implicit in that notion is that you hope that the United States will generate a coherent policy and will delineate some of the coherent policies in your mind. But do you truly believe that this country and the state capacity that we have and the coalition of interests that exists, so the multinationals, the parties, Congress, presidency, are we past the point of no return in terms of capacity to generate any coherent policy? And would you agree with me that this policy incoherence that we have right now is actually creating a world in which this problem of China-driven globalization is likely to get worse, rather than we will have solutions to that problem? So in other words, is a reasonable prediction based on what you diagnosed that it's going to get worse and the existing policy solutions are completely counterproductive to kind of counter the problem that you delineated?
So, yes, I think things will get worse before they get better. I do worry that we have limited capacity to get democratic consent for a set of more coherent policies, and that in key areas, state capacity is either eroding or been so outsourced to private interests that it functionally no longer exists. As I mentioned, our inability to collect tax out of our own pharmaceutical companies and to get Congress to vote on a tax law which would let us collect tax from our own pharmaceutical companies strikes me as a clear sign of declining state capacity. And that has added to my fear that you may be right. On the positive side, the world didn't look great at various points in our history, and we pulled together and we did stuff. And I do hope, maybe hope is the right word, that we will find collective solutions that are more coherent than what we have now. I don't think President Trump has ended up in a coherent policy space. I do think he was correct to highlight China as a problem during his first term. I think at some point that focus shifted, and I think Bob Lighthizer, as first-term trade representative, was a useful disciplining force. So I do think we are debating some of the right questions. I also think that our political system is designed towards all of the above with a tilt towards special favored interests in a way that makes me uncomfortable. And I hope that we somehow generate something analogous to the 1986 tax reform, where we tore everything up and started off with a cleaner, more coherent system. And I think that, which is not the old status quo or the new status quo. And I think on tariffs and trade policy, we need someone who will come up with this new coherent system where everybody gives up some of their old past privileges, but we end up with something that sort of works collectively in some ways. But yeah, you're not wrong.
I think you'd all agree with me that we owe a debt to Dr. Setzer, unfortunately for him, not a financial debt, in globally educating and economically educating us. So that was terrific. Thank you so much for that. Just one reminder about the next program, which will be on a Wednesday, February 18th, as opposed to February 19th. I think. Well, we had to adjust something to accommodate the speaker, who will be Jonathan Panikoff of the Atlantic Council. He is actually kind of an Iran expert, but he'll also be talking about the broader competition, economic, political, and strategic among the United States, Russia, and China in the Middle East more broadly, but there'll be a significant component of Iran, and we look forward to having all of you here then. Daniel?
Thank you very much. Once again, I just want to thank our speaker, very interesting economist, Brad Setzer, helping us understand the world. And as Larry said, I hope you come to our future talks. Now that I managed to run through the beginning, I thought I would slow down a moment because I realized I just feel badly about this Savannah Book Festival. Somehow I dropped the ball here. So I wanted to make clear what I was talking about as a prize for the trivia night. It's the novelist tickets, which provide you. Anyway, I will post this on the website. That's the easiest way to put it. It's a really great opportunity for those of you who love the book fair to get into events, get specific, general tickets, get special tickets, access to author talks, special seating, all kinds of benefits come with this Novelist Prize. And I have it written down. I thought it was going to be printed at the table, but it's not. In any case, please look on the website. We encourage you to come to International Trivia Night. We hope you come to our future programs. Thank you so much for participating in our annual meeting of the year, and we will see you at our next meeting. Thank you.